"You don't belong here, sir. You need to leave. Right now." The words cracked through the quiet like a judge's gavel. Several heads turned. Crystal glasses paused halfway to lips. The piano music drifting through the executive lounge faltered under the sudden tension. And in the far corner, a man slowly opened his eyes. Rain hammered against the glass walls of the private terminal at Teterboro Airport. Sheets of grey water blurred the runway lights outside, turning the world into a dull smear of white and silver. It was the kind of weather that made commercial pilots nervous, the kind that grounded small aircraft. But inside the Ether Executive Lounge, the wealthy barely noticed. Leather chairs, mahogany tables, a low murmur of expensive conversations. And in the corner sat a man who looked like he had wandered in from the wrong side of town. His hoodie was charcoal grey, faded at the cuffs. His running shoes were streaked with dried mud. Not a designer brand in sight, just practical clothes, worn and tired, like their owner. His name was Ethan Walker, 36 years old, and at this moment he looked like a man who had not slept in 2 days. He leaned back in the chair, one hand loosely wrapped around a paper coffee cup that had long since gone cold. His jaw was rough with stubble. His shoulders slumped from exhaustion. But his eyes, when they opened, were calm, clear, watching. Standing in front of him now was Brandon Whitaker. 48, tall, perfectly pressed navy suit, silver cufflinks that caught the lounge lights every time he moved his hands, the manager of the terminal, a man who believed in order, standards, appearances, and right now, Brandon Whitaker's patience had run out. He stared down at Ethan the way a homeowner might stare at a stray dog on the porch. "I said," Brandon repeated, louder this time, "you can't sit here." A few nearby guests turned their chairs slightly. Not enough to appear curious, just enough to watch. A woman in a pearl necklace leaned toward her husband. "What's going on over there?" The husband shrugged but kept watching. Ethan sat up slowly. The movement was unhurried, controlled. "I'm waiting for my plane," he said. His voice was quiet, gravelly from lack of sleep. Brandon gave a short, humorless laugh. "Your plane." He glanced around the lounge, inviting the room to share the joke. "Sir, this lounge is reserved for private aviation clients and their guests, not drivers, not delivery personnel, and certainly not." His eyes traveled deliberately over Ethan's hoodie. "Whatever this is." A low ripple of amusement moved through the room. Ethan didn't react. He studied Brandon for a moment, the way a surgeon studies a patient before deciding where to cut. "Check the flight manifest," he said calmly. "Name's Walker." Brandon didn't move. Instead, he leaned closer, close enough for Ethan to smell the expensive aftershave. "I know every name on that manifest," Brandon said, "and none of them belong to a man wearing hiking mud on his sneakers." Across the room, a tall man in a tailored suit chuckled into his whiskey. "Looks like somebody wandered into the wrong country club." More laughter. Soft, polite, the kind rich people use when they don't want to appear cruel. But cruelty was there, hanging in the air. Ethan exhaled slowly. The camera of the moment lingered on his hands. Rough knuckles, a faint scar across one finger, hands that didn't look like they belonged to a billionaire tech executive. They looked like the hands of someone who built things. Brandon straightened his tie. "I'm going to make this simple," he said. "You're leaving." A young waitress nearby froze mid-step. Her name was Emily Carter. 24, new to the job. She held a tray with a fresh cup of coffee, the one Ethan had ordered earlier. Her eyes moved between the two men. "Mr. Whitaker," she said quietly. He asked for coffee. Brandon turned sharply. "Take it back to the kitchen." Emily hesitated. "He doesn't seem to be bothering anyone." The silence in the lounge thickened instantly. Brandon's smile vanished. "Emily," he said slowly, "your job is to serve drinks, not defend trespassers." Her cheeks flushed red. She lowered the tray. "Yes, sir." Across the room, someone whispered, "Finally. Somebody enforcing standards." Brandon turned back to Ethan. "Last chance." Outside, thunder rolled across the runway. Ethan stood up, 6'2", taller than Brandon by several inches. For a brief moment, Brandon stepped back without realizing it. But Ethan didn't move toward him. He picked up a worn black duffel bag from beside the chair. "Fine," Ethan said. His voice stayed calm. Too calm. "I'll wait outside." Brandon gestured toward the glass doors. Not outside the lounge. Outside the property. A pause. "You can wait on the public sidewalk with everyone else." A few guests laughed again. Ethan walked past Brandon without looking at him. But as he reached the doors, a man near the bar called out. "Hey." Ethan stopped. The man swirled the ice in his drink. "You forgot your dress code." More laughter. Ethan pushed open the glass doors. The rain swallowed him instantly. Cold wind cut through the hoodie. Water soaked the fabric within seconds. Inside, the lounge glowed warm and golden behind the glass. Brandon Whitaker adjusted his cuffs and exhaled with satisfaction. Order restored. Standards maintained. He turned to the bartender. "Champagne for the room," he said. But outside, under the terminal overhang, Ethan Walker wiped rain from his face and pulled a phone from his pocket. The screen glowed pale blue in the storm. He tapped one number. The line connected instantly. Captain Harris. The voice on the other end was steady. Professional. "Yes, Mr. Walker." Ethan looked through the glass. Inside, Brandon was laughing with the banker now. "How far out are you?" Ethan asked. 5 minutes to landing." Ethan watched the lounge carefully. Every face, every smirk, every quiet judgment. Then he smiled, slowly. "Good," he said. A beat of silence. "Don't just land." The engines of the coming moment were already beginning to turn. "I want them to know we're here." Captain Harris did not ask questions. He never did when Ethan Walker used that tone. Up in the cockpit of the Gulfstream G700, the storm rolled under the wings like a restless ocean. Rain streaked across the windshield in violent sheets. The runway lights of Teterboro shimmered through the darkness, blurred by water and distance. Harris leaned slightly forward in his seat, eyes fixed on the instruments. "How exactly do you want to make an entrance, sir?" he asked. Below him, the private jet cut through the clouds with quiet authority. $75 million of engineering, carbon fiber, polished aluminum, and power. On the sidewalk outside the terminal, Ethan watched the rain bounce off the pavement. His hoodie was soaked now. Water dripped from the edge of his sleeves. His sneakers squished against the concrete every time he shifted his weight. Inside the lounge, laughter carried faintly through the glass. He could see Brandon Whitaker pouring champagne for a small group near the bar. The banker with the whiskey raised his glass. Brandon leaned closer, clearly enjoying the attention. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Runway 19, Ethan said into the phone. "Yes, sir. That brings you past the front of the terminal." Harris glanced out at the runway lights. "Correct. Good." Ethan's voice lowered. "When you land, don't park where they tell you." A small pause filled the cockpit. Harris turned his head slightly. "Where would you like us to park, sir?" Ethan looked through the glass again. Brandon Whitaker was now pointing toward the door, clearly reenacting the moment he threw Ethan out. A few people clapped lightly. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Right in front of the building," he said. Silence. Even through the phone line, Harris could hear the rain pounding the fuselage. "That position is reserved for visiting heads of state," Harris replied carefully. "I know." Ground control crackled through the cockpit radio. "Kingpin 1, you are cleared to land runway 19. Taxi instructions to follow." Harris rested a hand on the throttle. "You want the nose facing the lounge windows?" he asked. "Yes." "That's going to make some noise." Ethan's smile returned. "That's the point." Inside the executive lounge, the atmosphere had settled back into its comfortable rhythm. The pianist in the corner resumed playing something soft and forgettable. Glasses clinked. Conversations about markets, hedge funds, and real estate drifted across the room. Brandon Whitaker stood near the marble reception desk, adjusting the knot of his tie. He looked pleased with himself. Richard Coleman leaned against the bar, swirling his drink. "You run a tight ship, Brandon." Brandon nodded modestly. "Standards matter." Coleman chuckled. Guy looked like he crawled out of a camping site. Another guest joined the conversation, a woman with silver hair and a tailored cream coat. "These days you never know who will wander into places like this." Brandon folded his hands behind his back. "That's why I'm here." Across the room, Emily Carter wiped down a table that didn't need wiping. Her eyes drifted toward the glass doors. She could still see the man standing outside. Rain soaked through his clothes, but he hadn't left. Something about that unsettled her. "He doesn't look dangerous," she murmured. A bartender nearby shrugged. "Doesn't mean he belongs here." Emily looked down at the coffee she had poured earlier, still sitting on the tray, still untouched. Suddenly the radio at the reception desk crackled. A sharp burst of static cut through the music. "Attention all ground units. Clear taxiway Alpha and Bravo immediately. Priority heavy arrival inbound." Brandon frowned. Priority heavy. That phrase had weight in the aviation world, usually reserved for presidents, oil princes, or people whose names never appeared in newspapers. Greg, the young receptionist, began typing rapidly. "I don't see anything scheduled," he said. The radio crackled again. "Incoming aircraft, Gulfstream G700. Call sign Kingpin 1. Requesting direct taxi to Gate 1. Brandon blinked. Gate 1. He turned slowly toward the windows. Gate 1 was directly outside the lounge, reserved for the largest visiting aircraft. "That's unusual," Coleman said behind him. Greg looked up from the screen. "Very unusual." Outside, the storm deepened. Thunder rolled low across the runway. Then the sound arrived. At first it was a vibration, a deep rumble that crept through the floor beneath their shoes. The water in the glasses on the bar began to tremble. Emily felt it through the tray in her hands. "What is that?" someone whispered. The rumble grew louder, stronger. The piano stopped mid-note. All eyes moved toward the windows. Through the rain-streaked glass, 2 brilliant white landing lights burst from the darkness. The jet emerged from the storm like a predator. Long wings cutting through the rain, engines roaring with restrained violence. The Gulf Stream touched down with surgical precision. A burst of water exploded behind the tires. The aircraft rolled down the runway, massive engines humming like thunder. Inside the lounge, several guests stood. Coleman stepped closer to the glass. Good Lord. The jet turned off the runway. Instead of slowing, the engines spooled louder. The aircraft began taxiing directly toward the terminal, straight toward the windows. Emily's grip tightened on the tray. "That's too fast," she said. Coleman stepped back. The jet kept coming. Closer. Closer. The nose of the aircraft pointed directly at the lounge like a charging bull. Someone shouted, "Is he going to hit the building?" Brandon Whitaker froze. The aircraft filled the entire window now. 40,000 pounds of precision engineering. Rain blasted sideways under the force of the engines. At the very last moment, the brakes engaged. The nose dipped slightly. The jet stopped, just feet from the glass. So close, the engine heat fogged the windows instantly. Silence crashed into the lounge. The engines continued to idle with a deep, vibrating growl. Every glass on the bar hummed softly. Coleman leaned forward, staring. "That's a G700, he whispered. "I didn't think deliveries started yet." Brandon grabbed the radio from the desk. "This is terminal management," he snapped. "Who authorized that aircraft to park there?" No answer came. Instead, outside, the jet's door opened. Hydraulic stairs unfolded slowly. A flight attendant appeared at the top. Perfect navy uniform, white gloves, professional posture. She stepped down onto the wet tarmac. Then she opened a large black umbrella. But she did not walk toward the building. She turned and faced the sidewalk, where a soaked man in a grey hoodie had just begun walking toward the aircraft. The rain had not slowed. It hammered the tarmac like handfuls of gravel thrown from the sky. Water streamed off the wings of the Gulf Stream G700 and rolled in sheets down the fuselage, catching the floodlights and turning the aircraft into something almost unreal. Inside the lounge, no one spoke. Dozens of wealthy passengers stood frozen in place, staring through the fogged glass as if they were watching a scene from a movie that had suddenly become too real. The engines of the jet idled with a deep metallic hum that vibrated through the floor and into their bones. And outside, the soaked man in the grey hoodie walked straight toward it. Emily Carter felt her breath catch. "That's him," she whispered. Richard Coleman squinted through the glass. "Who?" the man Mr. Whitaker threw out. Coleman stared harder now. Through the rain, Ethan Walker moved calmly across the tarmac, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He didn't hurry. He didn't hesitate. The wind pushed against him. Rain whipped across his face, but he kept walking as if none of it mattered. At the bottom of the jet stairs, the flight attendant stepped forward. She raised the umbrella and held it over Ethan's head. Inside the lounge, the silence shattered. What the hell? Someone muttered. Brandon Whitaker's fingers tightened around the radio in his hand. That can't be right. Coleman leaned closer to the glass. The flight attendant spoke clearly, her voice carrying even through the storm as the lounge doors slid open behind Brandon. "Good evening, Mr. Walker. Your aircraft is ready." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Mr. Walker. Brandon felt the blood drain from his face. Outside, Ethan paused at the bottom of the stairs. Rain dripped from his hair. Water ran down the sleeves of his hoodie. He glanced back toward the terminal, toward the wall of glass, toward Brandon. For a moment, their eyes met, even through the rain, even through the distance. And in that instant, Brandon Whitaker understood something terrible. The calm in Ethan Walker's expression was not humiliation. It was patience. The flight attendant tilted the umbrella slightly. "Captain Harris asked me to escort you aboard, sir." Ethan nodded once. "Thank you." His voice was steady, controlled. He stepped onto the stairs. Each step echoed softly against the metal frame. Inside the lounge, the crowd leaned forward unconsciously, as if pulled by gravity. Richard Coleman turned slowly toward Brandon. "You told him to leave." Brandon swallowed. I didn't know." Coleman's eyes drifted back to the aircraft. "You might want to start knowing things." Outside, Ethan disappeared into the cabin. The jet door closed with a deep mechanical hiss. The engines continued to rumble. The rain hammered down harder. Inside the cockpit, Captain Daniel Harris removed his headset and turned halfway in his seat as Ethan entered. "Good evening, sir." Ethan dropped the duffel bag onto a leather seat. The cabin was warm, quiet. The smell of polished wood and new carpet filled the air. "Evening, Dan." Harris studied him for a moment. "You look like hell." Ethan let out a tired breath. 40 hours of negotiations will do that." "You closed the Redbridge deal?" Ethan nodded. $3.2 billion. Harris gave a low whistle. "That explains the mood." Ethan walked toward the large oval window on the starboard side. From here, the entire lounge was visible. Dozens of faces pressed toward the glass, watching, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Ethan folded his arms. "See the man in the navy suit near the reception desk?" he asked. Harris leaned slightly to look. "The one who looks like someone just pulled the floor out from under him?" "That's Brandon Whitaker." "The manager?" "Yes," Harris smiled faintly. "I'm guessing he wasn't very welcoming." Ethan didn't smile. "He told me to wait on the public sidewalk." Harris leaned back in his seat slowly. "Well," a pause. "That's unfortunate." Outside, the engines continued to vibrate the glass walls of the lounge. Inside the terminal, panic had begun to spread quietly through the room. Greg, the receptionist, stared at the computer screen in front of him. "I'm checking the aircraft registry," he muttered. His fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. Emily stood beside him, watching. "Well?" Greg's face went pale. "Oh no." "What?" Greg turned the screen slightly so she could see. The registration number of the aircraft glowed on the screen. "Owner: Walker Systems Holdings." Emily covered her mouth. "Oh my God." Across the room, Richard Coleman approached Brandon Whitaker slowly. "You didn't check the manifest," Coleman said quietly. Brandon's voice cracked. He said his name was Walker. Coleman nodded. "Yes." A long pause. "That was your first clue." Brandon's hands trembled slightly. He was wearing a hoodie. Coleman let out a short laugh that held no humor. "You work around billionaires, Brandon." He leaned closer. "They invented wearing hoodies." Inside the jet, Ethan Walker had already moved to the conference table in the center of the cabin. A secure laptop opened with a soft click. The screen lit up. Harris glanced back again. "You're not done with this, are you?" Ethan didn't look up. No. His fingers began moving across the keyboard with precise, controlled speed. Lines of financial data appeared across the screen. Corporate filings, ownership structures, lease agreements. Harris raised an eyebrow. "You're buying something?" Ethan finally looked up. "The terminal." Harris blinked once, then leaned back slowly in his seat. "Well," he said. That escalated quickly. Outside the lounge windows, lightning flashed across the sky. Inside, Brandon Whitaker stood motionless as the engines of Ethan Walker's jet continued to growl like a warning. And somewhere deep in his chest, a cold realization was beginning to spread. The man he had thrown out into the rain had not come to argue. He had come to wait. For the moment when the ground shifted beneath everyone else. The engines outside did not shut down. They kept humming, low and steady, like a warning that refused to fade. Inside the lounge, the vibration crawled through the floorboards and into the legs of every chair. Glasses trembled softly against polished wood tables. The sound was impossible to ignore. Brandon Whitaker stood near the reception desk, staring through the fogged glass at the jet parked only yards away. The floodlights from the aircraft washed the lounge in harsh white light, stripping the room of its warm luxury. It felt less like a sanctuary now, and more like a stage under interrogation. Richard Coleman finished his drink and set the glass down with a quiet tap. "You should go apologize." Brandon didn't answer. Coleman studied him for a moment. "You might still salvage something." Brandon swallowed. His throat had gone dry. Across the room, several guests were already whispering to each other, phones out, searching for information. A man near the window murmured, "Walker Systems, I've heard that name before." Emily Carter stood behind the bar, pretending to arrange glasses that were already aligned perfectly. Her eyes kept drifting to the jet outside. "Greg?" she said quietly. The young receptionist didn't look up from the screen. "Yeah. You said that plane belongs to him?" Greg nodded slowly. "Registered to Walker Systems Holdings." Emily's heart thumped in her chest. "That means he—" "Yeah," Greg whispered. "It means he owns it." Across the room, Brandon suddenly turned. "I need to speak to him." Coleman raised an eyebrow. "You think he wants to hear from you?" Brandon straightened his jacket. He has to understand this was a misunderstanding. Coleman's lips twitched. "Sure." Brandon marched toward the glass doors. Outside, the rain had intensified again. Wind whipped across the runway, pushing sheets of water sideways under the glow of the aircraft lights. He stepped through the doors and into the storm. The rain soaked his suit instantly. His perfectly styled hair collapsed against his forehead. Cold water ran down the back of his collar. But he kept walking toward the jet. Inside the aircraft, Ethan Walker sat at the conference table, the glow of the laptop illuminating his face. Financial statements filled the screen. Corporate filings. Ether Aviation Holdings, parent company of the terminal. Captain Harris watched from the cockpit doorway. "You found what you're looking for?" Ethan nodded once. Publicly traded. Over-leveraged on their Dubai expansion. He tapped a few keys. "They're bleeding cash." Harris crossed his arms. "And you're about to become the cure." Ethan leaned back slightly. $4 billion sitting liquid after the Red Bridge acquisition. Lightning flashed outside the window. "Seems like a good night to go shopping." A soft knock echoed through the cabin. Harris glanced toward the door camera display. "Well," he said quietly. "Speak of the devil." On the small screen near the entrance, Brandon Whitaker stood on the rain-soaked tarmac, holding one hand over his eyes as he looked up toward the cockpit. Harris smirked faintly. "Your fan club is here." Ethan studied the screen for a long moment. Water ran down Brandon's face. His suit clung awkwardly to his frame. "Let him wait," Ethan said. Harris chuckled. Outside, Brandon stood at the base of the jet stairs. The engines roared beside him, hot air blasting across the wet pavement. Rain hammered against his shoulders. He looked up at the closed door. Nothing happened. Behind him, through the glass wall of the lounge, dozens of people were watching. Coleman had moved to the front window, arms folded. Emily stood beside Greg, both staring. "He's just standing there," she said softly. Greg nodded. "Yeah." Minutes passed. Rain soaked Brandon completely now. His shoes squished against the tarmac every time he shifted his weight. Finally, the jet door opened. The same flight attendant stepped into view. She descended halfway down the stairs, umbrella still in hand. "Yes?" Brandon forced a polite smile. "I'm Brandon Whitaker, manager of the terminal." Her expression remained neutral. "And?" "I would like to speak with Mr. Walker." She didn't move. "I'm afraid Mr. Walker is currently in a meeting." Brandon blinked. "A meeting?" "Yes." He gestured vaguely toward the aircraft. "On the plane?" "Yes." The rain intensified. Brandon felt his patience fray. "This is important." She tilted her head slightly. "Important to whom?" The words landed like a slap. Brandon swallowed. "To him." The flight attendant studied him calmly. Then she spoke into a small headset near her collar. "Mr. Walker?" A pause. "Yes, he's here." Another pause. She nodded once. "Understood." She looked back at Brandon. "Mr. Walker will speak with you shortly." She turned and walked back up the stairs. The door closed again. Inside the jet, Ethan watched the man standing in the rain. Harris leaned against the cockpit doorway. "You're enjoying this?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. "No," he said eventually. "I'm finishing it." He reached for his phone. The contact list opened. Jonathan Vale, Chairman of Ether Aviation Holdings. The line rang twice. Then a tired voice answered. "Who is this, Jonathan?" Ethan said calmly. "It's Ethan Walker." Silence. Then a sharp inhale. "Walker, how did you get this number?" "We've met," Ethan said. "Golf club in the Hamptons, 2 summers ago." A pause. "Oh." "Listen," Vale said. "It's late. I'm currently sitting on the tarmac at your Teterboro terminal," Ethan replied. Another pause. "I was just removed from your executive lounge by your manager." The silence on the other end stretched longer this time. "I see." "He put me out in the rain," Ethan continued. "I'm sure it was a misunderstanding," Vale said quickly. Ethan glanced out the window. Brandon Whitaker still stood below, soaked, shivering slightly. "Maybe," Ethan said. "But misunderstandings have consequences." Vale exhaled slowly. "What exactly do you want?" Ethan's fingers rested lightly on the laptop keyboard. "I want the terminal." Vale laughed nervously. "You're serious?" "Very. That facility is worth hundreds of millions. I'll pay 20% above market value." The line went quiet again. "Tonight," Ethan added. "Cash transfer." Another long pause. "What's the catch?" Vale asked. "I take operational control immediately." Vale hesitated. "And if I say no?" Ethan looked once more at Brandon Whitaker, standing exactly where Ethan himself had been forced to stand not long ago. In the rain. Then Ethan said calmly, "By morning I'll short your stock, expose the incident to every tech founder who flies through this airport, and turn that terminal into the most expensive mistake your company has ever made." Lightning flashed again across the storm-filled sky. The engines of the jet continued to rumble like distant thunder, and somewhere behind the glass wall of the lounge, dozens of witnesses were beginning to understand that the real storm had not even started yet. Jonathan Vale did not answer immediately. On the other end of the line, the faint clink of silverware and distant voices suggested a dinner interrupted. The chairman of Ether Aviation Holdings was not a man used to being cornered during a quiet evening with his family. Ethan Walker waited. Rain lashed against the aircraft windows. Outside, the engines of the Gulf Stream continued to hum with restrained power. Finally, Vale exhaled slowly. "You're threatening to buy my terminal because one manager made a mistake." Ethan's eyes remained on the man standing below the aircraft stairs. Brandon Whitaker had begun pacing now, back and forth across the soaked pavement, his shoulders hunched against the rain. "It wasn't a mistake," Ethan said. "It was judgment." Vale's voice hardened slightly. "Even so, this isn't how business works." Ethan leaned forward. "This is exactly how business works." He tapped the laptop once. Numbers shifted across the screen. "You're leveraged beyond comfort on the Dubai expansion. Your last earnings report missed projections by 8%. Vale said nothing. Ethan continued calmly. "You need liquidity." Another long pause. Inside the lounge, Richard Coleman's phone buzzed. He frowned and glanced at the screen. "What the?" He opened a finance app. Ether Aviation Holdings stock had begun moving. Not drastically, but noticeably. Coleman looked toward Brandon outside, then back at the aircraft. "Something's happening," he murmured. Greg leaned over the reception desk. What? Coleman showed him the screen. Ether's trading volume just spiked. Emily felt a chill run down her arms. Inside the jet, Ethan spoke again. I'm offering you a solution, Jonathan. Vale sighed heavily. You want the Taterborough lease? Yes. And you want it tonight? Yes. The rain hammered harder. Vale lowered his voice. Why? Ethan glanced at Brandon Whitaker again. Because sometimes a lesson needed a stage. But he didn't say that. Instead, he said, because I don't like doing business with people who think appearances matter more than facts. Silence. Then Vale spoke quietly. You'll pay 20% over market. Yes. Immediate transfer. Yes. Vale let out a long breath. You drive a hard bargain, Mr. Walker. I drive accurate ones. Another pause stretched between them. Finally, Vale said, Send the contract. Ethan's fingers moved instantly. The document appeared on screen. Electronic signatures prepared. Wire transfer authorization. 5 minutes later, the message arrived. Signed. Ethan closed the laptop slowly. Captain Harris watched him from the cockpit doorway. Well? Ethan looked up. It's done. Harris smiled faintly. You just bought an airport terminal while sitting on the runway. Ethan stood. Technically, I bought the lease. Outside, Brandon Whitaker had stopped pacing. He stood staring at the jet door again. His hands trembled slightly now. Through the lounge glass, Coleman watched him. Poor guy, Coleman muttered. Emily frowned. You feel baddened for him? Coleman shook his head. No. He glanced towards the aircraft. I feel bad for what's about to happen to him. Inside the jet, Ethan stepped toward a control panel near the conference table. A screen flickered to life. The terminal's internal communication network appeared. Security cameras, lounge displays, public announcement system. Harris raised an eyebrow. You're not wasting any time. No. Ethan selected the lounge broadcast feed. Cameras in the ceiling captured every angle of the room. Dozens of wealthy travelers, bartenders frozen mid-motion. Emily standing beside Greg. Coleman near the glass, and Brandon Whitaker just outside the doors. Ethan pressed one key. Inside the lounge, every screen suddenly went black. The television above the bar, the flight status monitors, even the decorative digital artwork along the walls. Guests looked up in confusion. What happened? Greg tapped his keyboard frantically. I didn't do anything. The speakers in the ceiling crackled softly. Then a voice filled the room. Calm, clear, controlled. Good evening. Every head turned toward the screens. The display flickered back on. And there he was, Ethan Walker, sitting at the polished conference table inside the jet. No hoodie now. He had changed. A dark navy suit, crisp white shirt, hair neatly combed back. The transformation was startling. The man they had laughed at minutes earlier now looked exactly like what he was. Powerful. Behind him, the cabin lighting glowed warm and precise. Some of you may remember me, Ethan continued. His voice echoed through the lounge. I'm the man who was asked to wait outside in the rain. Richard Coleman lowered his glass slowly. Across the room, a few guests shifted uncomfortably. Ethan folded his hands on the table. I was informed that this lounge maintains very strict standards. His eyes moved slightly toward the camera. Standards about who belongs. Outside, Brandon Whitaker stepped closer to the doors. He could hear the voice through the speakers now. His stomach tightened. Ethan continued. I was told that this space was reserved for the owners of the world. A quiet murmur rippled through the room. So I decided to follow that advice. Ethan lifted a document. The signed contract. 5 minutes ago, I purchased the controlling lease of this terminal. The room went completely silent. Not a whisper. Not a breath. Ethan set the document down. That means, he said calmly, that I now own the building you are standing in. Emily's hand flew to her mouth. Greg whispered, Holy. Coleman let out a slow laugh. Well played. Outside the doors, Brandon Whitaker staggered slightly. Rain streamed down his face. Inside the jet, Ethan leaned closer to the camera. And that means, he continued, voice steady and sharp, that Mr. Brandon Whitaker is now my employee. All eyes turned toward the doors, where Brandon stood frozen in the storm. The rain continued to fall. The engines of the jet continued to growl, and the quiet inside the lounge felt like the moment before a verdict was spoken. Brandon Whitaker did not move. The rain poured over him in heavy sheets, soaking through his suit, running down his face, dripping from his chin. Behind him, the jet engines growled, low and constant, like a storm that had chosen to stay. Inside the lounge, every eye was on him. Some guests had stepped closer to the glass without realizing it. Others stood frozen where they were, drinks still in hand, staring at the screens where Ethan Walker now filled the room with quiet authority. Brandon pushed through the glass doors. Water followed him across the polished floor, leaving a trail behind his shoes. He looked smaller now, not physically, but the confidence that had once filled his posture was gone. Mr. Walker, he said hoarsely, staring up at the screen. His voice echoed through the suddenly silent room. This is a misunderstanding. On the screen, Ethan Walker did not blink. He leaned back slightly in the leather chair inside the aircraft cabin. A misunderstanding, he repeated. The words were not angry. They were precise. Brandon swallowed. I didn't realize who you were. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Coleman leaned against the bar, arms folded, watching like a man who had seen this type of moment before. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. That's the problem. Brandon's shoulders tensed. I was protecting the standards of the lounge. Emily felt something twist in her stomach when she heard that. Standards. Ethan rested his hands on the table. Mr. Whitaker, he said slowly, do you know what my company does? Brandon blinked. I'm not familiar. Ethan nodded once. Walker Systems maintains back-end infrastructure for several financial exchanges in New York. He paused. Among other things, Greg whispered to Emily, that's the company that handles half the trading servers on Wall Street. Emily's eyes widened. On the screen, Ethan continued, If my systems go offline for even 10 minutes, billions of dollars freeze. Brandon's face drained further. Ethan leaned forward. So when you looked at me tonight and decided I didn't belong, you were looking at the man whose servers keep this airport's financial partners running. A ripple of murmurs spread through the lounge. Brandon opened his mouth, closed it again. Rain continued dripping from his sleeves onto the marble floor. "I'm sorry," he finally said. The word sounded fragile. Ethan studied him. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then Ethan spoke again. "Apologies are easy." His voice had hardened. "Judgment is harder." Brandon stepped forward slightly. "I've worked here 15 years. "I know," Ethan replied. That answer froze him in place. Ethan tapped a key on the laptop beside him. On the screen behind him, a document appeared. Employment records, Brandon Whitaker, Terminal Manager. Start date, performance reviews. Emily felt Greg stiffen beside her. "He's pulling up HR files," Greg whispered. Ethan's voice remained calm. "You've received 7 formal complaints in the past 5 years. Brandon's head snapped up. "That's not true." Ethan raised one eyebrow. "Disrespect toward support staff. Another key press, 2 incidents involving withheld tips from catering contractors. Another. 3 customer complaints involving discrimination." Brandon's face turned red. Those were resolved internally. Ethan's gaze sharpened. "Yes." His voice dropped. They were. The room was so quiet now that the faint ticking of the wall clock could be heard. Ethan folded his hands again. "Mr. Whitaker." Brandon stood motionless. "You told me to leave the property." The words fell into the room like cold metal. "You said I should wait on the public sidewalk." Brandon's lips trembled. "I didn't know." "I know." Ethan cut him off. "That's the point." Another pause. Outside, thunder rolled across the runway. Inside the jet, Captain Harris leaned quietly against the cockpit doorway, watching the scene unfold. Ethan looked directly into the camera. Brandon Whitaker. He spoke the name like a judge reading a verdict. "You are terminated." The word hit the room with physical force. Brandon swayed slightly. "For cause," Ethan added. Greg exhaled under his breath. Across the room, someone whispered, "Jesus!" Brandon lifted his hands slightly. "You can't just I can," Ethan said calmly. "I own the terminal." Silence crushed the room again. 2 large men stepped forward near the back of the lounge. They had arrived quietly minutes earlier. Private security, black jackets, broad shoulders, professional stillness. Ethan glanced toward the camera feed from the entrance. "Gentlemen." The guards moved toward Brandon. Brandon stepped backward. "This is absurd," he snapped. "I have rights." One guard spoke evenly. "Sir, we're going to escort you out." Brandon's voice rose. "I am the manager of this terminal." The guard shook his head. "Not anymore." They took him by the arms. Brandon struggled briefly. "You can't do this." Coleman watched with quiet fascination. "You might want to stop fighting," he murmured. The guards began guiding Brandon toward the back hallway of the lounge, not toward the main doors, toward the service corridor. Brandon twisted his head toward the screen. "Mr. Walker, please." For the first time, Ethan's expression softened slightly, but not with sympathy, with something colder, understanding. "You were very clear about the rules earlier tonight," Ethan said. His voice filled the room again. "Riffraff used the service exit." Brandon froze. "No." The guards continued walking him backward. "No, wait!" The kitchen doors swung open. The sound of the rain rushed inside. Cold wind followed. The guards shoved Brandon out into the storm. The doors slammed shut behind him. Inside the lounge, no one spoke. The rain outside swallowed the man who had ruled this place for 15 years. On the screen, Ethan Walker watched until Brandon disappeared into the darkness. Then he leaned back slowly. The engines of the jet outside began to rise in pitch. The storm was not finished yet. The service door slammed shut behind Brandon Whitaker, and the sound echoed down the narrow hallway like the final strike of a hammer. For a moment he stood there, stunned. Rain hit him immediately, cold and relentless, driven sideways by the wind. The floodlights from the jet carved his shadow across the wet pavement. The engines were louder back here, deeper. The sound vibrated through his ribs. He looked at the fence line beyond the service lane, blinking rain out of his eyes. Just minutes ago, he had been the man who controlled this place. Now he was standing outside it. Inside the lounge, the silence remained thick. Ethan Walker was still on the screens, still calm, still in control. But something in his expression had shifted. The anger had passed. What remained now was precision. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket. "I want to apologize to everyone in the lounge tonight," he said. His voice softened slightly, though the authority in it remained unshakable. "This situation was not the evening you expected." Guests exchanged glances. Some shifted in their seats. Others remained standing, unsure what posture was appropriate in the presence of the man who now owned the building beneath their feet. Ethan continued, "I know many of you have flights waiting." He tapped a key. The screens briefly flickered with the terminal's operational dashboard. "So as a gesture of goodwill, tonight's landing fees and fuel costs are covered." The room erupted in quiet disbelief. Richard Coleman let out a low whistle. "That's a generous apology." Greg leaned toward Emily. "Fueling a private jet can cost $50,000. Emily's eyes widened. Across the room, a man near the bar murmured to his companion, "I like this guy already." But Ethan wasn't finished. "There is one more personnel decision I need to make." The room fell silent again. Emily Carter froze behind the bar. Ethan glanced down briefly at a second monitor beside his laptop. Then he looked directly back into the camera. Emily Carter. Her name hung in the air. Emily's tray slipped from her fingers. Glass shattered on the floor. Her voice caught. "I'm here." Dozens of eyes turned toward her. She felt suddenly very small, standing in the middle of the room. Ethan's expression softened slightly. "You tried to serve me coffee earlier." Emily nodded nervously. "Yes, sir. And when Mr. Whitaker told you not to." Another nod. "You hesitated." Emily's face flushed red. "I didn't think it was fair." A faint smile touched Ethan's lips. "Exactly." He leaned back slightly. "You showed something this place has been missing." The room leaned closer to the screens. "Respect." Emily stared at him. "I'm just a waitress." Ethan shook his head once. "No." He paused. "You're the new terminal manager." The room exploded with noise, gasps, a few scattered claps. Even Coleman straightened from the bar. Emily looked like someone had suddenly pushed her off a cliff. "What?" Her voice barely came out. "I don't know anything about running a terminal." Ethan's voice remained steady. "You know how to treat people." A pause. "The rest can be taught." Greg stared at her. "You just got promoted about 20 floors up." Emily laughed weakly. "Is this real?" On the screen, Ethan nodded. "Your salary will be tripled." Her knees nearly gave out. "And starting Monday, my operations team will train you." Emily wiped tears from her face quickly. "I don't even know what to say." Ethan gave a small shrug. "Next time I land here." He leaned slightly closer to the camera. "Just make sure the coffee is hot." Laughter rippled through the room. Real laughter this time. Not the polite, cutting kind from earlier. The screens flickered. The broadcast ended. The jet engines outside suddenly roared louder. Everyone rushed toward the windows. The massive Gulf Stream G700 began to roll away from the terminal. Floodlights swept across the rain as the aircraft turned slowly onto the taxiway. Emily stood frozen in the middle of the lounge. Greg nudged her. "You're the boss now." She looked around the room. The same guests who had ignored her hours earlier were now staring with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Coleman approached first. He extended his hand. "Congratulations, Miss Carter." Emily shook it automatically. "Thank you." Outside, the jet accelerated down the runway. Water exploded behind the tires. The engines thundered. Within seconds, the aircraft lifted into the storm clouds and vanished into the night. Back near the service road, Brandon Whitaker watched the lights disappear into the sky. Rain dripped from his sleeves. The wind pushed against his soaked suit. For the first time in 15 years, the airport gates were closed to him. And somewhere high above the storm, Ethan Walker leaned back in the quiet cabin of the jet. Captain Harris glanced over from the cockpit. "Quite a night." Ethan looked out the window into the darkness. "Not really." Harris raised an eyebrow. "No?" Ethan's voice was calm again. "Just business." Below them, the lights of Teterboro faded into the distance. But the lesson left behind in that lounge would linger much longer. Because sometimes power doesn't shout. Sometimes it waits quietly in the rain, until the moment everyone else realizes who was standing there all along. 3 weeks later, the rain was gone. Autumn had settled over northern New Jersey, and the air around Teterboro Airport carried the dry scent of jet fuel and fallen leaves. The sky above the runways glowed pale gold in the late afternoon light. The terminal looked the same from the outside. Glass walls, polished steel, quiet wealth behind closed doors. But inside everything had changed. The sign above the reception desk no longer read Ether Executive Lounge. It now read Sterling Lounge. Emily Carter sat behind the large oak desk that used to belong to Brandon Whitaker. The office door stood open. Sunlight spilled across the floor where Brandon's framed certificates once hung. Those had been taken down. In their place were white boards filled with flight schedules, staff rotations, and training notes. Emily leaned back slightly in the chair, holding a headset between her shoulder and ear. "No, that charge shouldn't be on the pilot invoice," she said firmly. Coffee for flight crews is complimentary now. She listened for a moment. Yes, I know it wasn't before. A small smile crossed her face. Well, it is now. She hung up the phone and exhaled. Running a terminal was not something anyone learned overnight, but she was learning fast. Greg stepped into the office holding a tablet. "You've got a visitor." Emily looked up. "Who?" Greg tilted his head toward the lobby. Richard Coleman stood near the reception desk, the same tall banker from that night. The man who had laughed. Emily stood slowly. "Send him in." Coleman entered the office with his hands tucked casually into his coat pockets. "Ms. Carter." "Emily," she corrected gently. "Emily." He looked around the office. Different energy in here. Emily smiled faintly. "That's the idea." Coleman nodded toward the whiteboards. "You've been busy. Mr. Walker gave me a lot to fix." Coleman chuckled. "That sounds like him." He shifted slightly. "I actually came to apologize." Emily tilted her head. "For what?" Coleman glanced toward the window where a private jet was taxiing slowly across the runway. "For laughing that night." A pause. Emily studied him carefully. "You weren't the only one." Coleman nodded. "That's not really the point." Emily folded her hands on the desk. "You understand the rules here now?" Coleman smiled faintly. "Respect everyone." "Exactly." He gave a small nod. "Understood." Coleman turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "Out of curiosity," he said, "what happened to Whitaker?" Emily's expression changed slightly. "I believe he's pursuing other opportunities." Coleman let out a soft laugh. "I imagine he is." Across the city in Newark, Brandon Whitaker sat in a plastic chair beneath flickering fluorescent lights. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and motor oil. This was not an executive lounge. It was the waiting area of a logistics warehouse. A faded poster on the wall read, "Horizon Freight Solutions." Below it, a small sign announced "Open Interviews." Brandon adjusted the collar of his shirt. It was cheaper now. The suit he wore had been purchased 2 days ago at a discount store. His Italian shoes were gone. Water had ruined them the night he was thrown out of the terminal. Across from him, a truck driver in a reflective vest scrolled through his phone. Another man sat beside a stack of shipping crates reading a newspaper. No one recognized Brandon. No one cared. A door opened. "Mr. Whitaker?" Brandon stood quickly. "Yes." The man who called him was broad-shouldered, wearing a safety vest and carrying a clipboard. "Come on in." The office behind the door was cramped, boxes stacked against the walls, a coffee maker sputtering quietly on a metal shelf. The manager sat behind a desk. Mike Sullivan, 45, thick forearms, a face weathered from years around loading docks. He flipped through Brandon's resume. "You ran a VIP terminal at Teterboro." "Yes," Brandon said. Mike leaned back in his chair. "That's fancy." Brandon forced a small smile. "I have experience managing high net worth clients." Mike clicked his tongue thoughtfully. Then he turned his monitor around. A video played. Brandon's stomach dropped. It was the clip. The moment security dragged him out into the rain. The footage had been recorded by a passenger and uploaded online. Millions of views. Mike watched Brandon carefully. Internet doesn't forget. Brandon looked down. I know. Mike leaned forward slightly. You planning to treat truck drivers the way you treated that guy in the hoodie? Brandon shook his head quickly. No. His voice was quieter now. I learned my lesson. Mike studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I can't hire you as supervisor. Brandon's chest tightened. But we do need a night dispatcher. He slid a form across the desk. $18 an hour. Brandon stared at the paper. $18. He used to spend that on a cocktail without thinking. Mike shrugged. You log trucks, make coffee for drivers. Brandon hesitated. Then he nodded. I'll take it. Back at Teterboro, the glass doors of the Sterling Lounge slid open. A sleek black helicopter settled onto the nearby landing pad. The rotors slowed. A man stepped out. Simple black t-shirt, jeans, backpack slung over one shoulder. Ethan Walker walked toward the terminal entrance. Greg greeted him first. Good evening, Mr. Walker. Ethan bumped fists with him. How's the coding class going? Greg grinned. Almost done with the Python module. Good, Ethan said. Keep going. Emily stepped out of the office. Boss? Ethan smiled slightly. Emily. She gestured towards the lounge. Revenue's up 15%. 18, Greg corrected from the desk. Ethan looked around the room. Pilots chatting with staff. Coffee cups on tables. No one ignored. No one judged. He nodded once. The culture changed. Emily smiled. Yes, it did. She handed him a small envelope. This arrived this morning. Ethan opened it. Inside was a cashier's check. $4.50, and a handwritten note. He read it silently. Mr. Walker, I owe you for a coffee. I was arrogant. I lost everything. I am starting over from the bottom. Preston Whitaker. Ethan folded the note carefully. Everything okay? Emily asked. Ethan slipped the check into his pocket. He's learning. Emily nodded slowly. What should we do with it? Ethan looked out across the runway, where his jet waited. Give him time. A pause. Then maybe give him another chance. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the Sterling Lounge glowed warmly against the darkening sky. The Sterling Lounge had become quieter in the evenings. Not empty. Never empty. But calmer. The kind of calm that came from people feeling welcome instead of watched. Soft jazz drifted from a trio in the corner. Pilots spoke with ground crew without lowering their voices. Coffee machines hummed constantly, free for anyone who needed a cup before a long flight. Emily Carter stood near the window reviewing a tablet when a young ramp worker approached the front desk. Ma'am? She looked up. He held a clipboard awkwardly. The crew for the Challenger asked if they could grab sandwiches before departure. Emily didn't hesitate. Of course. They said they can pay. She shook her head. No charge. The worker smiled. Thanks. As he walked away, Greg leaned over the desk. You're ruining the profit margins. Emily smiled faintly. Mr. Walker says people who feel respected come back. Greg shrugged. Hard to argue with 18% revenue growth. Across the room, a pilot raised his coffee cup toward Emily in silent thanks. The lounge doors opened quietly. A man in a grey business suit stepped inside. Richard Coleman, again. He paused just inside the doorway, glancing around. The difference in atmosphere was impossible to miss. 3 weeks earlier, this room had felt stiff, exclusive, guarded. Now it felt alive. Coleman approached the desk. "Evening." Greg nodded. "Good evening, Mr. Coleman." Coleman gestured toward the room. "Feels like a different place." Emily joined them. "That's the plan." Coleman smiled faintly. Walker changed more, though. More than the sign on the door. Emily crossed her arms lightly. He didn't change it. He just removed the parts that didn't belong. Coleman studied her for a moment. "You've grown into the job quickly." Emily shrugged. "I had good motivation." Coleman glanced toward the runway, where a jet engine roared in the distance. "Where is the man himself?" "Landing soon," Greg said. Coleman nodded thoughtfully. "You know, most billionaires would have fired everyone that night." Emily leaned against the desk. "That's not how he works." Coleman chuckled. "No." He looked around again. "He builds things." Outside, the evening sky turned deep purple as the sun slipped below the horizon. Lights flickered on along the runway. Moments later, the familiar sound of rotor blades filled the air. A sleek helicopter descended toward the landing pad beside the lounge. Inside the waiting area, several passengers turned toward the window. "Is that his?" Greg nodded. "Yep." The helicopter touched down gently. Dust and leaves swirled in the rotor wash. The door opened. Ethan Walker stepped out, backpack over one shoulder, his black t-shirt moving slightly in the wind. No security entourage. Entrance. Just the quiet arrival of someone who had somewhere to be. Inside the lounge, the glass doors slid open before he reached them. Greg greeted him first. "Evening, Mr. Walker." Ethan bumped fists with him again. "How's the coding going?" Greg grinned. "I'm building my first app." "Good." Emily approached next. "Flight ready?" Ethan nodded. "Fuel topped?" "Full." He looked around the room slowly. Pilots chatting. Passengers reading quietly. Staff moving confidently through the space. A place that felt human. He turned back to Emily. "You did good here," she shook her head. "We did." A small smile crossed Ethan's face. He pulled the folded note from his pocket. "Did you ever find out where this came from?" Emily nodded. "It was mailed from Newark." Ethan looked toward the window for a moment. Newark, across the river. Warehouse districts. Freight yards. Hard work. Greg leaned forward slightly. "You really thinking about giving him another chance?" Emily looked curious. "Are you?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He unfolded the note again briefly. The handwriting was uneven. A man trying to steady his pride while writing an apology. Then Ethan folded it once more. "People deserve the chance to prove they've changed." Greg raised an eyebrow. "You're a nicer boss than I expected." Ethan chuckled quietly. "No." He glanced toward the runway where his jet waited. "I just know how the world works." Emily tilted her head. "How's that?" Ethan slung the backpack over his shoulder again. "Power tests character." A pause. "But losing power tests it more." Across the lounge, a pilot approached. "Mr. Walker, we're ready for departure." Ethan nodded. "Appreciate it." He turned toward the doors. Before leaving, he looked back once more. At the room, at the people working inside it, at the culture that had replaced the old one. "Keep the coffee hot," he said. Emily laughed. "You got it." Ethan stepped outside into the cool evening air. Across the runway, his Gulf Stream waited under bright lights. The engine started moments later, deep and powerful. Inside the lounge, several passengers moved to the windows. The jet rolled forward slowly. Coleman stood beside Emily, watching it. "You know," he said quietly. "What?" "I think Whitaker learned something." Emily nodded. "I hope so." The aircraft turned onto the runway. Engines roared to life. The jet surged forward, slicing down the strip of light and asphalt. Within seconds, it lifted into the sky. Coleman watched the tail lights fade into the dark. Then he glanced toward Emily. "Funny thing about power." Emily looked at him. "What?" Coleman smiled faintly. "The people who deserve it rarely have to prove it." Behind them, the Sterling Lounge continued humming quietly with life, a place built not on appearances, but on respect. 6 months later, winter settled quietly over Teterboro. Cold air drifted across the runway in thin waves that bent the lights into soft halos. Snow from the night before clung to the edges of the taxiways, pushed aside in long white ridges by the airport plows. The Sterling Lounge glowed warm behind its glass walls. Inside, the atmosphere had become something rare in places like this. Calm. Not the stiff calm of wealth trying to impress itself. The calm of people who knew they belonged. Emily Carter walked through the lounge with a clipboard tucked under her arm. She paused at a table where 2 pilots were finishing their coffee. "You good for departure?" she asked. One of them grinned. "Best coffee on the East Coast." Emily nodded. "Safe flight." She continued toward the reception desk where Greg was typing quickly on a laptop. "Another coding project?" she asked. Greg didn't look up. "Testing an API connection." Emily laughed softly. 6 months ago, you were checking boarding passes." Greg finally glanced up. 6 months ago, you were serving coffee." They shared a small smile. Across the lounge, the sign Sterling Lounge reflected softly against the glass. It had become a name people talked about now. Pilots preferred landing here. Passengers asked for it by name. Not because it was the most expensive, but because it felt different. Respect had a way of changing places. Outside, the distant hum of engines approached. Greg glanced at the runway monitor. "He's early." Emily already knew who he meant. Moments later, a sleek Gulfstream G700 appeared through the pale winter sky, descending smoothly toward the runway. The aircraft touched down with quiet precision. Snow dust lifted behind the wheels as it rolled toward the terminal. Inside the lounge, several passengers moved closer to the windows. They recognized the plane. People tended to recognize power when it moved that quietly. The jet taxied to its usual spot near the glass wall. Engines slowed. The door opened. Ethan Walker stepped out into the cold air. Dark coat pulled loosely around his shoulders. 6 months had not changed his appearance much. Still simple. Still unpretentious. But there was something about the way he moved. The quiet gravity of someone who carried enormous responsibility without needing to display it. The lounge doors slid open before he reached them. Greg greeted him first. Welcome back, Mr. Walker. Ethan smiled slightly. How's the app? Greg lifted his laptop. Beta testing. Good. Emily approached from behind the desk. Flight from San Francisco. Long one. She handed him a cup of coffee without asking. He took it. Perfect timing. Ethan looked around the room. Pilots talking with mechanics. Passengers reading quietly. Staff moving through the lounge with confidence. No tension, no judgment. Just people doing their jobs. You kept the promise, he said. Emily tilted her head. What promise? The one about respect? She shrugged. That was your idea? Ethan shook his head. It was always supposed to be that way. Near the window, a delivery courier entered quietly, carrying a small envelope. Package for Mr. Walker. Greg took it and handed it over. Ethan turned the envelope over in his hands. The return address was simple. Newark. He opened it carefully. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was steadier than before. Mr. Walker, 6 months ago, you changed my life in a way I didn't understand at the time. Losing everything forced me to see the world differently. I am working nights at Horizon Freight. $18 an hour. It is honest work. I make coffee for drivers now. Funny how life works. The view from the bottom teaches things the top never could. Thank you for the lesson. Preston Whitaker. Ethan folded the letter slowly. Emily watched his expression. Bad news? He shook his head. No. He slipped the letter into his coat pocket. Just someone learning. Greg leaned forward. You going to help him? Ethan considered the question for a moment. Outside, the engines of his jet began preparing for the next flight. Power humming quietly under metal and glass. Maybe someday, Ethan said. People deserve the chance to earn their way back. Emily nodded. The lounge door opened again as another group of passengers entered, shaking snow from their coats. Life continued. Flights departed. Planes arrived. People moved through the building every day without realizing the story that had changed it. Ethan finished his coffee. Time to go. Greg walked with him toward the door. Where to next? Chicago. The cold air rushed in as the doors opened. Ethan paused for a moment before stepping outside. He looked back once more at the lounge, the place that had once thrown him into the rain, now a place built on something better. Respect. He stepped out onto the tarmac and walked toward the waiting jet. The engines rose slowly in pitch. Minutes later, the Gulf Stream lifted into the winter sky and disappeared above the clouds. And the lesson from that rainy night stayed behind at Teterboro. A simple truth about power. The person you look down on today might be the one signing your paycheck tomorrow. True strength is not in expensive suits or loud voices. It is in how you treat people when you believe they have nothing to offer you. If this story meant something to you, support the channel by hitting like and subscribe for more stories like this. And in the comments below, leave 3 words that matter more than any title or position. Stay humble, always.